Let me ask you about this. If you think about money, I say that we don't want money. Nobody wants money. What we want is the goods and services that money buys us. But if you think about money, for example, it's like an exchange of value. It represents value exchange. So I could say, hey, Luke, let me come over to your house and help you move this weekend. Or, hey, let me come build a fence for you. Or let me paint your house. Or let me build a website for you. If I, as a friend, were to say, hey, I'm going to help you move this weekend, then I would have built goodwill with you. And you would sort of owe me a favor back, right? We're not going to write it on paper, but like maybe you would help me do something.
A social credit.
A social credit, right?
Yeah.
So then really by me providing you value, it's sort of like a favor. And now you give me an IOU that you owe me a favor, some value in the future. But that's like a barter system. So if we want to scale past the barter system, then we need something, a sort of IOU that I could go to give somebody else. So the dollar sort of represents an IOU. So I've built you a fence. I helped you move. You give me an IOU that's recognizable. It's a medium of exchange to get other favors from other people.
Yes.
And if you think about that philosophically, then I'm going to say something people don't like to hear. And that means that if you're broke, you're kind of selfish. How much goodwill have you put into the world? How many IOU slips are you sitting on? In that barter environment, if I helped you move and you move and you move and I built you a fence, a new website, and I collected all these favor IOU statements, the person that had the most amount of favor IOUs, you would say, man, that guy's really generous.
Because you get paid in proportion to the value that you provide.
Bingo.
And the thing is, the marketplace will pay you in proportion to that. So if you have no value to provide, it's either you don't know how to provide value, or nobody can see the value you can provide because either you don't showcase it or it's just not there. I agree fully.
Yeah. It's an interesting way to look at it when you look at it from a philosophical angle. Let's talk about it now from like a more of a, we'll stay on the philosophical, but let's look at it from like a freedom angle. Now, I've often said many times, and I strongly believe, that there is no freedom without the freedom to transact. And really it starts with the freedom of private property. So back to me being able to store my value, store my energy, that's my first form of private property. Do I store it in dollars or Bitcoin or gold, or do I store it in a ranch with cows? However I decide I want to store that, that's my life battery. So that's my property. And if you take that cow from me or take my money from me, that's my life. You're literally stealing it. But then the freedom starts with being able to control the private property, but then more importantly, be able to transact. And so we see today that the governments of the world want to continue to impede that ability for us to transact freely. And I'm curious your point or your point of view coming from Argentina. So Argentina is sort of the textbook example today of sort of a society breaking down and hyperinflation where people couldn't even hold their money anymore. And as I was with you and your team in Spain last year, I was told that I wasn't really aware of this. Like, you're not even allowed to spend much of your money. So I think
you're not even allowed to spend. You have X amount of dollars that you can withdraw per month.
But I think maybe it was Yemi from your team said like you couldn't even spend more than $300 a month on your credit card.
You couldn't.
Because or they would exchange at a very high rate, 700 to 1 or something like that, right? So like they wouldn't even allow you to spend your own they wouldn't allow you to spend your own money. Capital controls lock you in, and then they would just continue to steal from you.
And the crazy part is people need to understand that the money system isn't just an accounting system. It's a tool of power. So when the coinage was created, for example, 700 year 700, around BC 700, I think it was, in Turkey, that was the first introduction of the coin, right? So coin, just like Bitcoin, it's not money, it's technology. It's technology of what? The remittance of value. That's all it is. So the coin was the standardized remittance of value from A to B. I could actually move it. How do you make a cow divisible?
Right.
If I want to sell you a ranch and it's going to cost me 19.5 cows, it makes no sense because now I have half a cow that's worthless. So it's no scalability in that idea. So now I have money, and as soon as money came into the side of like coinage, you begin to see barons, kings, people that could actually hold currency and had some sort of, in this case, back in the day, it would be army that could sustain their sovereignty. You would do quite well with coinage. The issue with coins is that they began to get debased. So they introduced metals that would debase the currency. So for example, Rome, let's say they conquered the entire known world and they had no more kingdoms to conquer. Therefore, no more gold production. Therefore, no more economic growth. So they had to debase the currency. The issue with that is that now you no longer know what's legit. you no longer know what's false. Remember how there's this verse in the Bible that says that God abhors the misbalancing of weights.
Right.
Because back in the day, gold wasn't measured by units, it was measured by weight. So everything had to have a fair balance. Now we have the introduction of the fiat system, which was initially a physical representation of the gold.
It was an IOU.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Now the IOU got overprinted, bullshit. Now the government got into bed with this entire scam, i.e. the introduction of Bitcoin, which goes back to the bartering system, but with the technological advancement of no middleman necessary. What happens in society, especially with governments, is the new technological advancement produces a temporary period of time of sovereignty. So when coinage came, new barons rose, new sheiks rose, new czars came into power, new money. Same thing happened with the radio. As soon as the radio was introduced into the house, one of the big criteria for the government to control every single outlet on the news, which was the source of technological transformation, the radio. As soon as the internet came, we had a few years of internet freedom, where people could look up information, see all the details, boom, then censorship. You had that technological period of boom where people got free. And now you're in a situation where you had social media come into play. Social media came into play. They censored social media really deeply, but now you have the cracking of social media. So there's technological advancements that produce what? Freedom. So if you look at the etymological use of the word to think or thinking, it was extremely popular pre-introduction of the radio in the household. So people used to think freely prior to the government coming into the house. As soon as the radio came into the house, you can look up the etymological use of the word and the popularity of it, to think, thought, freedom of thought. The moment the radio was introduced into the house, that use of word went down. People stopped to think. When did that word begin to emerge again? The moment the internet became placed in the house. So a seek of freedom and truth and thinking. Once again, now you have the introduction of new technology, which is what? Bitcoin on the monetary side, which is the disruption of the financial system that we've been under for the last 100 years. So now people are waking up and there's there's something else. Whether Bitcoin is the future or not is not relevant. What happens is that Bitcoin showed that there is another way of transacting outside of the now controlled technology of remittance. Now we have a decentralized form of remittance that gives us the ability within a few years, before they have digital IDs and ID me and all this garbage to access the internet, a few years to become extremely wealthy in this period of time, because we have this technological differentiator. So if people understand technology frees you, and then technology gets controlled, and technology frees you again, and technology gets controlled, your job is to figure out what's the next pocket of technology I can take advantage of for my next power play. So if you look at the future, what are you going to need? You're going to need autonomous AI that runs off of your scripts, not off of somebody else's scripts. You're going to need unmanned machines that work specifically for you. That's technological advancement. That's part of the future. So money, in my opinion, will eventually become obsolete. When I have bots, when I have robots, when I have AI working for me, half of the jobs are not going to be commercially viable. Maybe it's not 10 years, 20 years, but in 50 years, we will get there. So money will no longer be valuable. So what will money be? And that's where the question becomes store of value and things of this nature. But technology is always evolving, always moving, but it always comes down to the transactions of goods and services.
Yeah. Well, I guess it depends on what you consider money. I mean, if I think of money as a medium of exchange, we're always going to need a medium of exchange.
Yes.
So money's not going to go obsolete. What we know as money and what we even consider value will change.
Crazy.
So value will change, just like information changed. Back to your point before radio, and even in the 80s, information was what I got on the Nightly Loser in my morning newspaper. Today, I see a kid in Thailand post a picture on the beach, and I see what the water looks like. I see the temperature, so like all this information that wasn't there. So I think value changes, but humans are always going to exchange.
Yes.
We're always going to exchange. That's what capitalism is. In my book, The Uncommunist Manifesto, we really kind of honed in on that specifically, which is capitalism is not a political modality. It's human nature. So capitalism is private property, using it more efficiently, and free trade among others. I have a fire, you killed a rabbit. Hey, cook your rabbit on my fire. Let's just share that, right?
And the beauty of Bitcoin is that it lets you do that at scale.
At scale.
Multi-border, without being present, with a money type that people internationally accept as a form of value,
yeah,
which is incredible, and it's never happened before, which is the fascinating part about Bitcoin that I absolutely love.
I'm curious your standpoint on this, because you came from Argentina where the money's wrecked. Like literally impoverishing people, right? And you travel the world, so you talk with a global audience, if you will. Do you think that helped you understand why we need a non-government money like Bitcoin better than most people in the U.S. who are like, well, what do we need different money for?
I grew up in a small town. It's not a village, a small town of 12,000 people. I would go to my local steakhouse, a small little steakhouse, 5 different tables, 1 server, cook on an Argentine style grill. The Argentine peso to the dollar, I remember the time I was 11 years old, buying, my dad took me to that steakhouse, and I think it was a filet mignon or something like that. It cost $3. It was 9 pesos. Today, the dollar to the peso is in the hundreds.
3 to 1?
Yeah, 3 to 1.
3 to 1.
It would cost me $1 to take a taxi. So everything that was nice about Argentina was the fact that the dollar was cheap, and still the peso was pretty healthy. But today, you see the introduction of socialism, you see the debasement of currency, and truly, the big thing that I see, which is the big shell shock factor based off of my study of history, is that this cycle that Argentina went through of the debasement of currency, the nationalization of privatized assets, and the introduction of a socialist, super vampire-like government isn't the first time that it happened in history. I was talking with Andrew. It happened in Korea. It happened in Cuba. It happened in Bolivia. It happened in Venezuela. You have a lot of countries where you have these socialist-type governments that come in, they leech everything from private citizens, and they debase the currency by stealing everything. Now, what happens because they steal everything? They still have to get loans. There's still debt. To who? Most likely the IMF. So what happens? You have now the IMF being introduced into the scenario, and they're quote-unquote the bad guy. But simultaneously, they're the good guys. So you don't know how to look at them because they're the ones that are putting you in debt, and they're the ones that are pulling you out of debt back and forth, back and forth, back and forth like a loop cycle. So here you have a socialist government that's most likely put in place. You have a period of normalization of making sure that the government owns all the national assets, the airlines, the petrol companies, the railways. They own everything. But obviously we know that governments can't run shit because they're incompetent. So these products, these goods, these services, they become shitty. Now you have massive inflation. Not only do you have massive inflation, you have massive debt. That debt needs to get paid off. So you have the introduction of a right-wing party, right? It happened with Perón. It happened in probably the 40s and the 50s, post-World War II, when the United States began to introduce the fight against communism. So you had this introduction of right-wing kind of police states come in. And my thesis is that these right-wing police states, you either have Bukele, you have Milei, you have different individuals. Their purpose is one very simple, in my opinion. It's the repayment to the IMF of all the debt. So here you have a right-wing politician or somebody that's more on the liberal side that says, okay, we privatize, we need to sell off all national assets. Okay, perfect. What are you doing with that money? You have to pay back the IMF, motherfucker. Like, that's why you're here. So create the entire inflation system, prop a ton of debt, and then bring somebody through a police state, can pay off that debt, and then run the cycle back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. My thesis was very simple, and you're going to see it play out because I've been predicting the future for quite a bit of time now. You're going to see it happen with people introducing third parties. So no longer right-wing party, left-wing party, you'll have a third party emerge that'll be self-funded. So you look at the president of Ecuador, he's not right-wing, left-wing, he's a new guy that just emerged. New party. Milei, not left-wing, right-wing, new party. And what happens? Young guys, right-wing, fucking hate the old system, but they still have to play the rules of the game because they're in debt. Who's going to pay off that debt? The IMF. So what I see is I look at these cycles and these loops and I try to figure out where in the loop, because it's happening, these jackals, it's happening, where in the loop is this country or this stage, and how can I succeed in it? Now, before the introduction of right-wing police states or heavier duty kind of controlled systems, which I think right-wing governments tend to do more than left-wing governments if given too much control, and they'll do it especially under the name of safety and security. Because remember, Trump is the one that introduced the vaccine. Trump is the one that introduced all the lockdowns and all these things. Whether it was his willpower, his introduction, it doesn't really make a difference. There's a precedent that right-wing, and I'm not any political party, I'm just an observant from the sideline, they tend to introduce more of police rule. On the other side, you have the other guys that introduce a lot of state rule, and they'll introduce a lot of, hey, the government is going to be your daddy and manage your things. But in between here, you have the narrative creation. And the narrative creation is the pendulum swings either to the left or to the right. And we've seen it, and you've probably witnessed it, a pendulum swing at an energetic level moving to the right through history. So the question is, where do you position yourself to not get fucked by these guys that are debasing the currency, but simultaneously not being in a system where there may be right-wing police states? So when I left Argentina at the age of 16, it was under the premise of there's a socialist culture that's coming. And it wasn't that I knew that shit was going to hit the fan like how it went to become one of the most worthless countries in the world, even though
from one of the richest.
Even though in 1890 it was one of the wealthiest countries in the planet. I just left simply because in the US there was more opportunity.